G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Ready to start part 7 of my partial book reading of Tim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman, who shot a very great deal of the footage which appeared on the television once we got one after 1967 when I was a kid. Every night, just before the weather, there'd be 5 minutes of now the news from the war. And as often as not, it was Neil Davis's footage. So, here we have the second part of Saigon, Pearl of the Orient. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 22nd July 1967. Continental Palace Hotel, Saigon. Air Marshal Kai came to power so quickly at so young an age that he pushed his luck too far. In very plain language, when they took account of guns on the table, Kai didn't have enough. General Thieu will undoubtedly now be president. He will be okay. The main thing is to maintain stability. Another thing is that Vietnamese people respect age and are wary of youth. Kai is only 36. Thieu is only 44, but a deep thinker and open to compromise. Respect for age is one of the main reasons why Ellsworth Bunker was appointed American ambassador. The Americans at last, in some small way, are starting to understand the Vietnamese. Bunker is about 73 years old, a fine, upstanding, grey-haired, distinguished, quietly spoken, humble gentleman. This counts a tremendous amount with the Vietnamese. The previous ambassador, Cabot Lodge, was a schemer, almost assuredly a more astute politician, but he wasn't old enough or humble enough. General Maxwell Taylor before Lodge was a disaster, although in the situation he was the logical choice. A fine military man, decisive, straightforward, but too prone to try to force his ideas, and not enough Vietnamese-style dignity. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 27 July 1967, Continental Palace Hotel, Saigon. The Australian Minister for the Army, Malcolm Fraser, is here at the moment, young and impressive looking, but really a dreary bore with little intelligence to look further than he is officially shown, which is in direct contrast to another young MP, Andrew Peacock, who recently visited here at his own expense. He holds old Bob Menzies' blue ribbon seat of Kooyong and was really inquisitive and intelligent. He's only about 28 years old. Neil Davis did not spend a great deal of time with Australian troops, but covered major news events such as the visits of Prime Ministers Harold Holt and later John Gorton, and the arrival of the task force at Nui Dat on the aircraft carrier Sydney. He had a high opinion of the operational efficiency of the Australians, but had to assess their contribution to the war as a whole. I didn't go out with the Australians much, because relatively speaking, they didn't do much fighting. They did have 2 or 3 very stiff battles, but that was over a period of several years. As an Australian, I was very proud of the Australian troops. They were very professional, very well trained, and they fought the people they were sent to fight, the Viet Cong. They tried not to involve civilians, and generally there were few civilian casualties inflicted by the Australians. The Australians were highly trained in jungle warfare. They rarely made contact with each other by voice, but used hand signals. Unlike the Americans, they didn't wear flak jackets or helmets, so they did not get so tired on patrol. They also adopted a policy of not using jungle tracks, which Davis believed worked against them. I believe that 50% of Australian casualties were caused by landmines and booby traps. When the communists found the Australians weren't using the tracks, they became very smart about this, and the Australian practice of not walking down the jungle tracks but fanning out through the jungle was turned against them. The VC would discover and sometimes reposition Australian mines that had been left in ambush positions, which were then triggered by the Australians themselves. Meanwhile, the VC were using the jungle trails like highways because they knew the tracks were free. Nevertheless, Davis conceded that the Australians did win military control of their designated area. But when they pulled out, the area at Nui Dat in Phuoc Thai province reverted to Viet Cong control. They had not, in the phrase of the time, won the hearts and minds of the people, but had some limited success in the same way the South Koreans did. Over the years in Vietnam, Davis saw more of the members of the Australian Army training team, 30 to 40 warrant officers and sergeants who acted as advisors to Vietnamese units all over the country. They gave them training in the field on fire discipline and how to outflank an enemy, and it was all done by demonstration. They were very effective and well liked by the Vietnamese. They shared the same hardships as their men and generally got on well with them and with the Vietnamese villagers. When we finish the chapter, if there's time on the available upload limit, I'll tell you a few stories about one of those warrant officers. He was a second cousin of mine. Neil spent more time with the 50,000 strong Korean ROK force in Quy Ninh province than with the 6,000 Australian troops. He was one of the first correspondents to visit the Koreans in their operational area, and he told the ABC's Don Simmons to go and take a look at them. Quote, "Jesus, they're a tough mob of fuckers." Unquote. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 27 July 1966, Hotel Indonesia, Jakarta. I was notified yesterday that I had been named Cameraman of the Month for June or perhaps May. It wasn't quite clear. The award was for, as they say, his splendid coverage of the Korean Tigers operating in South Vietnam, in particular, and his coverage from this extremely dangerous theatre of war in general. His coverage was hard yet sympathetic, brutal yet tender, and full of understanding for the almost overwhelming task facing them. Oh well, it doesn't mean all that much, so I donated the prize money to a suitable fund for the relief of Vietnamese war victims in London. When Davis first arrived in Saigon in 1964, the city was still French in style, with tree-lined streets and outdoor cafes. But terrorist grenades drove the customers indoors behind sandbagged walls, and the narrow streets reverberated to the unceasing roar and clatter of heavy military vehicles. Countless thousands of farting two-stroke motorcycles, three-wheeled motorised cyclos, and a solid phalanx of battered Renault taxis and assorted private vehicles. The English-language newspaper, the Saigon Post, used to run daily ironic cartoons under the heading Saigon, Pearl of the Orient, and Davis was saddened over the fate of this once lively city, as he was over the wretched situation of many of its inhabitants, particularly the beggars and orphans who lived on the streets. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 4 January 1971, Continental Palace Hotel, Saigon. Saigon is more crowded than ever, and pollution is at a fantastically high level. The pollution recording machine, or whatever it's called, refused to work in Saigon some months ago. It's worse now, which is terribly unhealthy for everybody and everything that lives here. Even the trees are dying. That was 1971. This is a 1972 photograph, as is this one. Returning to the Australian Army training team, 30 to 40 warrant officers and sergeants who acted as advisors to Vietnamese units all over the country. Probably around 1969 or 1970, Christmas holidays, because we were in Glen Innes, not at the coast, which is where we spent May and September holidays, a cousin of my mother's spontaneously arrived, unannounced, just showed up, with his wife and 3 kids and a carload of camping gear, and he was wanting to know where you could go camping as a family here in the Glen Innes district. There was a kind of a dude ranch operating out at Rediston. It was a sapphire reserve, and you could go and pay money to camp there, and then you could dig holes in the mud beside the water hole beside the Rediston Creek, and you could wash for sapphires, use sieves and pans and stuff. So this cousin of my mother's invited me to go along with his kids, and off we went and set up a tent. And I learnt how you go looking for sapphires in the mud, and decided actually getting a bit of meat on some string and fishing for crayfish was much more fun. And unknown to me, Mac was back in the middle of a tour of Vietnam on R&R because the platoon of Montagnards that he commanded in their remote base had been overrun, and he'd been found under the pile of bodies. He'd crawled under there to stay alive. So they flew him back to Australia and gave him a month's holidays. And yeah, he put the missus and Billy Lids in the car, and off they went to go on holidays, and I was along as part of it. And there was a hell of a big thunderstorm. And, there's Mac as the tent's trying to lift off the ground, and we're all still sitting in it, and he's trying to hang on to the tent, and we're being lit by nothing but lightning, flash bang, flash bang, flash bang, really close around us. And he was, looking very stressed out, very stressed out. And I was like maybe 8, maybe 10, and I had no idea that, less than a week ago, he'd been lit up by the flashbangs of mortars while he was being overrun. So anyway, being a good patriotic little kid, the next day after we went to town and borrowed my father's tent poles to come and put Mac's tent back up so he could continue on with his holiday for the R&R. I did ask him, like, what's it like over there in the war? Because I'd been interested in Vietnam since I was about 5, when a cousin of mine said, well, if you want to be a soldier, you have to go to Vietnam to be a soldier because there's no war in Glen Innes. And Mac said that it wasn't like normal war where the enemy wore uniforms and you could see who they were. He said the big problem was that you might see a kid younger than I was at the time, so 7 years old or so, who'd come up to you in the street, and you'd tell them to stop and they'd keep coming. You tell them to stop and they'd keep coming. You tell them to stop and you'd keep coming. You'd have to shoot them because they had a hand grenade behind their back. You could hear it hissing, sort of thing, and you knew you had to shoot them or you were going to die. So when I was a kid, and when the Vietnam War was still on, still a thing on the TV, and he was going back there after this camping holiday, like this was halfway through his second tour. I think it was his second tour. I know he did 2 tours in Nam, and I went camping with him when he was fresh back from being overrun. An interesting experience. But then when I was growing up and a registered nurse, and he was an old man, fire brigade captain, had a block of flats, I went and visited him, and I asked him if he could tell me anything about a thing called Operation Phoenix, because I read about it in a book called The 10,000 Day War, and it's called that because that's how long the Vietnam War went for the Vietnamese. Only lasted about 4,000 days for him, like 11 years. But 1945 to 1975, that's 10,000 days, you see. The thing about Operation Phoenix, as the book said, 26,500 people were taken in for questioning. Nobody was known to survive the interrogation process. So I asked Mac about it, and he said that when Operation Phoenix began, he'd get notification to take out a Viet Cong tax collector who was going to be in a particular room of a particular house in a particular village on a particular night. And he said the first time he took, platoon of Montagnards with him, and they crept into the village and they snuck into the house and they tippy-toed down into the room, and they got into the room. And then the regulation said the Montagnards had to do all of the fighting of the war. He was just commanding them. So they opened up on the bloke with M16s, and that woke the whole village up. And I think he lost 3 killed and 5 wounded just fighting his way back out of the village. And he thought that was a pretty silly idea. So he said next time they snuck into the village and they crept into the house and they tippy-toed down to the bloke's room, and he said he just got a silenced 22 automatic pistol and popped the fella in the back of the head, and then they crept back out. They didn't have to do as much fighting that way. He didn't contradict anything that the history book said about Operation Phoenix. He just added garnishing to the detail. When he told me that story, it was around breakfast time, and he broke 2 raw eggs on his front teeth and swallowed them whole. Not the shells, but just broke them into his mouth. And then he washed them down with a teacup full of rum. He used to drink a crate of 12 bottles of rum per week, and he had 2 garbage bins going for his homebrew kit to make a garbage bin full of beer every week, because he drank a garbage bin full of beer every week, as well as what he drank at the club. Because having started off as a commando at 17 in World War II and been to Malaya and Vietnam twice, I think Borneo as well, alcoholism was an allowable disability on his repatriation pension. Warrant officers were expected to drink a lot. On that same visit, I asked Mac's youngest son how come his father got out of the army. And he said, well, because the old man was a warrior and Australia wasn't going to fight any more wars before he got too old to do it, so there was no point staying in. Just like Neil Davis, once he got a taste for it, nothing in life was worth doing as much as being in war. Warbles on like the YouTube. Ciao.